A billionaire walked into a small diner in Maplewood, expecting nothing more than coffee, and walked out understanding that the wife he had lost a year and a half ago was carrying his child and waiting tables for tips, while he had been mourning her in a glass tower in the city. Adrian Vance had not planned to stop in Maplewood. He had been driving back from a long, polite, and entirely unnecessary board meeting in Albany, and the thought of 3 more hours of highway between him and his empty penthouse had made his hands tighten on the wheel of the dark sedan. So when the exit sign appeared at the bend, with its hand-painted promise of pumpkin pie and homemade soup, he took it without thinking, the way a man takes a deep breath without thinking, because his lungs are tired. The town came up around him in slow, autumnal frames. Red maples lined a single main street. A bookshop with a green awning sat next to a flower stall draped in chrysanthemums. A church spire rose at the end of the road. He drove past a hardware store, a yarn shop, and a barber pole that still spun, and at the last corner, before the road turned back into farmland, he saw the diner. Maplewood Diner. White clapboard, a long row of windows, an old neon sign in the shape of a coffee cup. He pulled into the gravel lot, killed the engine, and sat for a moment looking at the steam fogging the lower edges of the windows, at the warm yellow light inside, at the line of mismatched stools along the counter. The sky above the roof was the soft, washed-out blue of late October, and a wind moved a few brittle leaves across the lot. He told himself he would stay for 1 cup of coffee. The bell above the door gave a small, clear ring as he stepped in. The smell hit him first. Bacon, coffee, fresh bread, cinnamon. The second thing was the warmth, that simple, gathered heat of a small place full of people on a cold morning. The third thing was the woman behind the counter, pouring coffee for an older man in a flannel shirt, and the way she tilted her head as she listened, and the small, steady, attentive smiles she gave the man, as if his stories had earned it. Adrian's heart stopped working for a full second. He had stood in dozens of rooms full of perfectly composed people. He had walked past models in marble lobbies and senators in private dining rooms, and never once felt his body fail him. But here, in a diner in a town he could not have named 10 minutes earlier, his heart simply paused, then slammed back into rhythm so hard he felt it in his throat. It was Lila. Her hair was longer now. She had pulled it back into a low knot at the nape of her neck, and a few wisps had come loose around her temples. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat of the kitchen and the press of the morning rush. She wore a soft, pale blue waitress dress with a white half-apron tied at her waist and a small gold name tag pinned above her heart. And over the apron, very gently, the rounded curve of a pregnancy that even at a distance he could tell was not a small one. She was carrying a child. He stood in the doorway, with his hand still on the door, and the bell above him gave one last small chime as it settled, and the town and the diner and the autumn and the year and a half of his life all seemed to tilt and reshape themselves around her, around the round of her belly, around the careful and capable way she set the coffee pot back on the warmer. Maggie Doyle, the woman who owned the diner, looked up from the cash register and gave him an automatic, warm smile. "Sit anywhere you like, sweetheart. Lila will be right with you." He had not heard her name spoken out loud in a year and a half. He moved on legs that did not feel like his own to a small 2-person table near the window, the farthest one from the counter, and slid into the worn red vinyl booth, and pretended very carefully to study the laminated menu while his hand shook around the corner of it. He would not approach her. Not yet. Not before he understood. She had not seen him. She was bent slightly over the order pad, writing something for an older woman with bright pink lipstick, and her body moved with a small, protective lean back from the counter that he recognized at once as the stance of a woman whose center of gravity had moved without her permission. She listened with the same patience he remembered from their 3 years of marriage, the same way she had listened to the maitre d' at the plaza when he stumbled over their last name, the same way she had listened to his mother's friends when they tested her with little, polished, contemptuous questions. with dignity. With an attention so steady, it made the speaker feel for a moment like the only person in the room. She had been gone for exactly 17 months and 4 days. He had counted them. The young busboy came by to fill his water and slide a placemat in front of him, and Adrian managed to ask for coffee in a voice that sounded almost normal. He kept his eyes on the menu. He did not lift his head. He had to think. When he had been told, on a clear, bright Wednesday morning in May, that his wife had taken the small suitcase she had arrived with and walked out of their apartment without leaving a forwarding address, he had assumed at first that there had been a mistake. The doorman had thought it was strange too. She had not cried. She had not raised her voice. She had taken her grandmother's silver hairbrush and one photograph from the bedside table and a navy wool coat, and she had asked the doorman to please tell Mr. Vance that she was sorry. She had not left a note. She had not answered her phone. She had not, in 17 months, contacted him a single time. He had hired men in dark suits to find her. He had paid them very well. They had told him she did not want to be found, and that she had been clear about that, and that the money he was offering would not change that fact. He had been a man who had grown used to money changing facts, and so for a long time he had refused to believe them. Eventually, around the 11th month, he had stopped looking. Not because he had stopped wanting to find her, because he had begun to understand that wanting a thing did not entitle you to it, and that what he had taken for love on her side might have been only kindness, and what he had taken for permanence might have been only patience. He had been wrong about that, because he was looking at her now, in a small diner in a town he had not chosen, and the look on her face as she listened to a stranger tell her about his arthritis was not the face of a woman who had walked out because she had stopped loving him. It was the face of a woman who had walked out because somebody had made her. She turned, finally, with 2 plates balanced on her left forearm and a coffee pot in her right hand, and she crossed the floor toward an older couple in the booth across from his, and as she passed, she looked up. Their eyes met for 1 second, just one. Lila Reeves did not drop the plates. She did not gasp. Her training as a curator and a quiet, watchful woman who had grown up knowing when a person in the room had to be managed kept her hands steady and her steps even. She gave him the small, polite nod a waitress gives a stranger. She set the plates down. She refilled the older man's coffee, and then she walked, calmly and with a slight, careful, pregnant gait, to the swinging door of the kitchen, pushed it open, and disappeared. Adrian sat in the booth, with his hand around a coffee mug that had appeared in front of him at some point, and stared at the door she had gone through. He understood, all at once, that he was not going to drink this coffee, and that he was not going to drive to the city tonight, and that his life, which had felt for 17 months like a wide and empty corridor, had just narrowed itself to a single, closed kitchen door and the woman behind it. He took a slow breath. He pulled out his phone. He texted Theo Lansing, his chief operating officer and the closest thing he had to a friend, 3 short words. Cancel my week. Then he set the phone face down on the laminate, looked out the window at the wind moving the leaves across the gravel, and decided, with a quiet and certain ache that had nothing in common with anything he had ever felt in a boardroom, that he was going to find out what had been done to her, and to him, and to the child she was carrying under that pale blue dress. He sat in that booth for 40 minutes. He did not approach the kitchen door. He did not catch Lila when she finally returned, with a deliberately neutral expression, to refill the coffee at the booth beside his. He did not embarrass her in her place of work, in front of her boss and her customers, and the town she had clearly chosen for refuge. He understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that whatever had driven her out of his life had been strong enough to keep her gone for 17 months, and that he would not pry it open by force. When the breakfast rush thinned, he left a generous bill on the table, weighted by the salt shaker, and stepped outside. The wind had picked up. The flag in front of the post office snapped against its pole. He walked across the street to the small inn he had passed on the way in, the Maplewood Inn, 4 rooms, a green door, a window box of marigolds, and he asked the woman at the desk if he might have a room for the week. She raised her eyebrows at his shoes and his coat, and the watch on his wrist, and his sedan in the lot. She told him a week was unusual at this time of year. He paid in advance, in cash, and signed his name in the register as Adrian V., not Adrian Vance, and she handed him a key on a small wooden tag and told him breakfast was at 8. He carried his overnight bag to a small, clean room with a quilt on the bed and a window that looked across the street at the diner, and he stood at that window for a long time, watching the diner sign light up as the afternoon shaded toward dusk, and he thought, more clearly than he had thought in 17 months, about what he had done wrong. Adrian Vance had been raised inside a particular kind of certainty. His grandfather had built a real estate fortune in the years after the war. His father had quadrupled it in the 80s, and then withdrawn quietly to a horse farm in Virginia after a long and thoroughly civilized estrangement from his wife. His mother, Vivian, had been left in possession of the apartment on Fifth Avenue, the box at the opera, and what she called the family standard, which she had defended for 30 years with the patience of a saint and the politics of a small empire. By the time Adrian had been old enough to ask questions, the certainty had already settled into the walls. There were people you spoke to, and people you did not. There were causes you supported, and causes you allowed your accountant to mention at parties. There were women you married, and women you did not. And any confusion between those categories was, Vivian said, a sign of a lazy mind. Adrian had not been lazy. He had been studious and tall and quiet, and he had let his mother arrange the world around him until he was 26 years old, and had walked into a small midtown gallery on a Thursday night out of obligation to a board member's wife, and had stopped in front of a painting of a winter field, and had heard a voice behind him say, very politely, "You are standing closer to it than the artist would want. He is fond of mid-distance." He had turned around, and he had seen Lila. She had been 24 then, junior curator in a small private gallery, with her hair in a careless twist and a grey wool dress and a streak of charcoal across the back of her left hand. He had asked her, with the smooth confidence of a man who had never been refused, if he could take her to dinner. She had looked at him for a long, considering second, and then she had said, "No, but I will walk you to the next painting, if you promise not to lecture me about acquisitions." He had laughed for the first time in a year. They had been married 8 months later, at a small ceremony at his mother's house in the country, with 75 carefully chosen guests and a clergyman his mother had flown in from England. Vivian had behaved very correctly that day. She had even, at one point, taken Lila's hands in hers and told her that she hoped Lila understood the great trust that was being placed in her. Adrian had not understood, at 26, how much that single sentence would later turn out to mean. He stood at the window of the Maplewood Inn now, at 33, and watched the lights inside the diner go gold against the evening blue, and he saw Lila lock the front door from the inside, turn the sign to closed, and walk slowly across the dim dining room with one hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He did not move from the window. He understood, without being able to explain it yet, that the trust his mother had spoken of on his wedding day had not been a kindness. It had been a contract. And somewhere in the 17 months and 4 days that he had been alone, that contract had broken Lila in a way she had refused to come home and tell him about. He drew the curtain back a little farther. He watched Maggie lock the diner from the outside, and he watched Lila walk down the sidewalk in her navy coat, the same navy wool coat she had taken with her when she left. And he watched her cross the street and turn at the corner toward the small bookshop. A light came on in the second-floor window above the bookshop, and a silhouette moved past it, and the silhouette was hers, and the curve of her belly was visible against the warm yellow shade. He let the curtain fall. He sat down on the edge of the quilted bed and put his head in his hands and, for the first time in 17 months, he allowed himself to admit that he was, in some quiet and broken way, still entirely and irrevocably in love with his ex-wife. And that, whatever it took, he was not leaving Maplewood until he understood why she had run. Lila Reeves had not let her hands shake. She had set the plates on the older couple's table. She had refilled the coffee. She had walked, with the deliberate, even pace she had practiced for 7 months now, into the kitchen, and she had pushed the swinging door closed behind her, and she had reached up and pressed both hands flat against the cool, stainless steel surface of the prep counter. And she had bent her head, and she had taken 3 long breaths. He was here. He was sitting in the booth by the window, in a coat she remembered from the last winter they had been married, and he was looking at her with the same quiet, attentive expression she had once mistaken for safety. She had known, on some level she had refused to inspect, that this would happen one day. The world was wider than the small town of Maplewood, but it was not wide enough to hold a Vance forever. He drove. He took meetings in Albany. He had a habit of getting off the highway when he was tired, the same way some men ordered a second glass of wine. She had walked into this kitchen on a Tuesday in March 7 months ago and made her peace, on the very first day, with the fact that he might one day come through that front door. She had been wrong about one thing. She had thought she would be ready for it. She was not ready. She was 32 weeks pregnant, and her ankles ached, and her back ached, and her shoulders ached. And she had been on her feet for 6 hours, and she had been holding the truth alone for 17 months and 4 days. And the sight of his face across the dining room had cracked something at the base of her throat that she did not want to examine in front of the busboy. The kitchen door swung open. Maggie Doyle stuck her head through. "Honey," Maggie said, in the low voice she used for fragile things. "You all right?" Lila lifted her head and gave a careful, even smile. "I think the baby is sitting on a nerve again." Maggie did not believe her. Maggie was 62 years old and had run the Maplewood Diner for 31 years, and had raised 2 daughters and 4 cats, and had read 2 romance novels a week since 1989. And Maggie knew the difference between a baby on a nerve and a woman whose past had just walked through her front door. But Maggie was also a woman who knew the value of letting another woman have 10 minutes alone in a kitchen. "Sit down on the stool there," Maggie said. "I'll handle the floor for a bit. Drink that ginger ale." Maggie set a small glass of ginger ale on the counter, patted Lila gently on the shoulder, and pushed back through the swinging door, and Lila sat down on the small wooden stool by the dishwasher and took a slow swallow of the cold, sweet drink. And she thought about Adrian Vance, who had once lifted her in his arms in their kitchen in the city and told her that she had married into a family that did not know what to do with her, and that he was sorry for that, and that he would learn. He had learned. She believed that. But he had not learned in time. She set the glass down. She took another long breath. She rested both palms on the soft round of her belly, and she felt the small, steady kick that had become, over the past 4 months, the one consistent piece of company in her life. "I will not run again," she whispered, very quietly, to the curve of her own body. "Not from him. Not any more. We will face this together." She had not been a waitress before March. She had been the junior associate at a small private gallery in Tribeca, and then she had been the wife of Adrian Vance, and then, for one strange, suspended year between leaving him and finally accepting that she could not afford a Manhattan rent on her own savings, she had been a woman drifting north along the Hudson, in cheap rentals and small towns, cleaning and tutoring and doing whatever a quiet, careful, art-trained woman could do without being recognized. She had washed up in Maplewood on a Sunday in March because her bus had broken down, and Maggie Doyle had given her a cup of soup at the diner counter and asked her, gently, how far along she was. Lila had been 5 months pregnant and very tired and trying not to cry into the chowder, and Maggie had said, in the tone of a woman who was used to making decisions on behalf of strangers, "There's a room above the bookshop. It's small, it's clean. The rent is $250 a month if you don't mind a slope in the floor. I need a daytime waitress. I do not ask any questions I'm not asked. If you stay, you stay." Lila had stayed. She had earned her wages and saved every dollar she could and walked to her doctor's appointments at the small clinic at the edge of town. And she had read used paperbacks borrowed from the bookshop downstairs, and she had slept 8 hours every night for the first time in 3 years. And she had felt the baby grow inside her with a steadiness that had, in a way, taught her how to live again. She had not let herself think about Adrian for more than a few minutes a day. It was going to be much harder, she understood, to limit those minutes now. "Lila!" Maggie's voice through the swinging door, gentle and careful. "He's still out there." Lila stood up. She straightened her apron. She tucked the loose wisp of hair behind her ear. She picked up the order pad and the pen. "I'm coming," she said. She did not approach his table at first. She moved methodically through her station, refilling sugar caddies and clearing plates, and writing down the regular order for old Mr. Henderson, who came in at the same time every day for the same bowl of vegetable beef and the same slice of cornbread. She let her hands and her voice find their familiar rhythm. She let the clatter of the diner remind her that the world had not ended at 10:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. When she finally walked toward Adrian's booth, she did so with the same calm she would have used on any customer she did not yet know. He looked up at her, with both hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "Lila," he said, very quietly. "Mr. Vance," she said, just as quietly, and she watched the smallest flinch cross his face at the second word. "Have you decided what you'd like?" He looked down at the menu, then back up. "Whatever you would recommend," he said. She did not let her face change. "The chicken pot pie is good today. Maggie made the crust this morning." "Then I will have that." She wrote it down. She did not meet his eyes again. She turned to go. "Lila." His voice was almost a whisper. "Please." She stopped, but she did not turn. She kept the order pad against her chest. Her free hand rested very lightly on the edge of his table. "Not here," she said quietly. "Please, not here." There was a pause. She could feel him fighting himself across the small distance between them. "Tell me when," he said, "and where. I will go anywhere you want." She closed her eyes. "Tomorrow," she said. 3 o'clock. The bookshop downstairs. There is a small reading nook in the back. I get off at 2. He let out a breath she had not heard him take. "I will be there." "Adrian." She used his name for the first time, and her voice almost broke on it, and she steadied it before the next word. "You will be polite. You will not raise your voice. You will not tell anyone in this town who you are. They have been kind to me. I will not have them disturbed. I will not disturb them. Thank you." She walked away. She delivered his pot pie 10 minutes later, without looking at him, and she refilled his coffee twice without looking at him. And when he paid his bill, she did not look at the amount of the tip, which was very large, and she did not look at the small folded note he had tucked under the salt shaker, which simply read, in his careful handwriting, "I am at the inn across the street. Whatever you decide, I will respect." She did not throw the note away. She put it in the small inner pocket of her apron, and she finished her shift, and she said goodbye to Maggie at the door, and she walked across the street to the bookshop and up the narrow back staircase to her small, clean room above it, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed in her navy wool coat, and she finally, after 17 months and 4 days, allowed herself to cry. She cried for 15 minutes, quietly, with her hand pressed against her mouth so she would not wake Mrs. Eldridge, who lived in the front room and went to bed early. Then she washed her face. She made herself a piece of toast. She drank a full glass of water. She put her hand on her belly, and she felt the small, confident kick. And she said, out loud, in the quiet of her small room, "Tomorrow we will tell him." Adrian arrived at the bookshop at 2:47 the next afternoon. He had spent the morning in his room at the inn, going over, in a small notebook, every conversation he could remember with his mother in the months before Lila had left. He had written down things Vivian had said at dinners. He had written down arrangements his mother had made, charity dinners, foundation announcements, the small and large social weights that had landed on Lila in their first 2.5 years of marriage. He had written down Eli's name. He had written down the name of his mother's lawyer, the elderly Mr. Pemberton. He had written down the dates of the 3 private meetings his mother had taken at the apartment in the spring before Lila had gone, with their times and their guest lists, all of which he could pull from his old assistant's calendar archive in 20 minutes. He was not going to bring the notebook to the bookshop. He was going to listen. He had learned that much at least, in 17 months of being unable to listen to her. He pushed open the door of Maplewood Books. A small bell rang. The shop smelled of paper and old wood and a faint trace of cinnamon from the bakery next door. The proprietor, a tall, thin man in a cardigan, looked up from behind the counter and gave him a polite, evaluating nod, and Adrian, in his charcoal coat, gave the polite nod back and walked past the front shelves toward the back of the shop. The reading nook was a small alcove with 2 worn green velvet armchairs and a low round table between them. A reading lamp on the table was already on. Lila was in the chair on the right, in a soft cream sweater and dark trousers, her navy coat folded across the arm of the chair. Her hair was down. The lamp's light caught the side of her face in a way that made her look, for just a moment, like the woman he had first seen in a midtown gallery, before all the rooms. He stopped at the edge of the alcove. "May I?" "Yes," she said. He sat down in the empty chair. He kept his hands on his knees. He did not reach for her. For a long moment, they did not say anything at all. Then she lifted her chin a little, the way she did when she had made a decision, and she looked him fully in the eye for the first time in 1.5 years. And she said, very quietly, "The baby is yours, Adrian." He had known, of course. He had counted weeks the moment he had seen the curve of her belly through her apron the day before. He had calculated, with the brutal precision of a man who could not afford to be wrong, the night they had last been together. He had known. But hearing her say it out loud, in her own voice, in a small bookshop, in a small town she had chosen because his world could not reach her in it, was a different thing entirely. He closed his eyes. He felt the back of his throat lock. He opened his eyes again, and he said, in a voice he barely recognized, "Thank you for telling me." She did not say anything for a moment. "I am sorry that you found out the way you did." "I am not." She tilted her head. "I'm not sorry that I found out," he said. "I'm sorry that I did not find out sooner. And I'm sorry that I needed to drive into a town I did not know to find out at all. But I'm not sorry to know." He paused. He swallowed. "I want to be clear about something. I'm not going to demand anything from you. I will not ask you to come back to the city. I will not ask you to come back to me. I will not ask you to do a single thing you do not want to do." "Then what are you here for?" He looked at her steadily. "I am here because somebody, 18 months ago, made you walk out of our apartment and not come back. I do not believe it was you. I do not believe it was your idea. I've had a long time to think about who in my life had the resources and the inclination. And I have a guess. But I'm not going to act on a guess. I'm going to ask you to tell me what happened, in your own words, in your own time. And I'm going to listen. Her eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall. She blinked, once, slowly, and the tears retreated, and she sat with her hands resting very lightly on the curve of her belly. And she looked at the man she had married, and she said, in a voice that was almost steady, "Your mother gave me a contract." He had expected to hear the word. He still felt as if he had been struck. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Lila told him, in the quiet of the back of the bookshop, with the reading lamp making a small warm circle around them, with the proprietor a polite distance away, pretending to alphabetize a shelf of poetry. The story she had carried alone for 17 months and 4 days. It had begun, she said, 2.5 years into their marriage, on a Thursday afternoon in early April. Adrian had been in Singapore. Vivian had invited Lila for tea at the apartment on 5th Avenue. Lila had gone, the way she always went, in a clean wool dress and small gold earrings, with the polite smile of a young wife who had learned that her mother-in-law preferred a calm face. Vivian had served the tea herself, which was unusual. The housekeeper had been sent on an errand. The maid had been given the afternoon off. Mr. Pemberton, the elderly family lawyer, had been waiting in the small library, with a leather folder on his knees, and a polite small wave when Lila had walked in. "It was a contract," Lila said. 12 pages. I read it twice. Adrian sat very still. "My mother had drawn it up," he said. "Yes. What did it say?" She took a careful breath. "It said that I would leave the apartment within 7 days, that I would not contact you in any way, that I would not contest the marriage in court, and that I would accept a one-time payment that I refused on the spot. It said that if I broke any of those terms, the foundation scholarship that my brother Eli had been receiving for the previous 2 years would be quietly withdrawn. The loans on my parents' farm in Vermont would be called in by a small bank that the Vance Foundation, it turns out, had purchased in 2017, and that there would be, and this is the phrase she used, Adrian, a permanent reassessment of the standing of the Reeves family in the small social circles where my parents still had friends. "She held the farm," he said. "She held the farm. She held the scholarship. She held the small set of social cruelties that would have crushed my mother. And she also, and I want to say this carefully because I want you to hear it, she also showed me 3 photographs that she had had taken of you. They were not real, Adrian. I did not believe they were real. But they were good enough that they would have ended your nomination to the Hudson River Trust Board. And that would have collapsed the bond rating on the renewal of the South Pier project. And you would have lost, I am quoting Mr. Pemberton, between $200 and $300 million, and the trust of every senior partner you had spent 6 years cultivating." Adrian's hands had become fists on his knees. "She threatened my career." "She threatened the only thing you cared about beyond me," Lila said quietly. "And she made it very clear that she would protect you from your own choices, whether you wanted her to or not. I would not have lost $200 million over a fake photograph." "Adrian," she looked at him steadily. "Yes, you would have. You and I both know that. The Hudson River Trust is a board of 19 people, 12 of whom your mother went to school with, 4 of whom owe her favors, and 3 of whom are simply afraid of her. She does not need a real photograph. She only needs a photograph the people in that room will pretend to believe." He could not argue with that. He did not try. "What did you do?" he said. "I asked her for time. I went home. I called Eli. He was in his 2nd year. He had 3 more semesters of full tuition on the scholarship, and he had no idea any of it was conditional. I called my mother. The farm has been in our family for 93 years. I called Pemberton's office and asked if I could have a copy of the contract to read in private. He sent it by courier the next morning. You signed it." "I signed it." On what day? April 22nd. You left on the 29th. Yes. He looked down at the carpet between their chairs. You did not tell me. I could not tell you. The clause was very specific. Any disclosure to you, in person or in writing, or through any third party, would trigger the withdrawal of the scholarship and the calling of the loans, immediately and without notice. You could have told me afterwards. I tried, Adrian. He looked up. I tried, 3 weeks after I left, when I called the apartment from a payphone in Buffalo, and your mother answered. And she said the words. Lila closed her eyes for a moment. Remember the contract. And she hung up. I tried 6 weeks after that, when I wrote a letter from a small post office in Lake Placid and addressed it to your office at Vance Holdings. And 3 days later, my mother received an itemized statement from the bank that held the farm, with a note paperclipped to it that said, "Overdue review." My mother had not received that statement before. I called Pemberton's office in tears. He told me, very politely, that the bank had simply taken an interest in the file, and that this kind of interest did not, of course, have to continue. She watched the mail at my office. She watched the mail. She watched the credit card. She watched the doorman. She watched Adrian with great care, because the contract was not really about a divorce. The contract was about silence. And the baby. I did not know, on the 29th of April, that there would be a baby. He looked up sharply. When did you know? 6 weeks later. I had been in 3 towns by then. I went to a small clinic in Saratoga. I sat in the parking lot for an hour. I drove home, to whatever room I had then, and I sat on the bed and I tried to think how I would tell you. I tried to think who I would tell first. I tried to think whether the contract would be different if there was a child. I read the contract again. There was a clause that anticipated this, Adrian. There was a clause that explicitly stated that any pregnancy was to be considered a personal matter to be handled at my discretion, with the understanding that any attempt to use a child to reopen the marriage would be considered a breach. He was, for a long moment, not breathing. She wrote a clause about a child, he said, before she knew there was one. She is a very thorough woman. She wrote a clause about a child, and she made you keep it from me. Yes. He stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not pace. He simply stood up because his body refused in that moment to remain in a chair. He walked 4 steps to the small window of the alcove, looked at the back garden of the bookshop, where a few brittle daisies were still blooming, and put one hand against the cold glass. He turned after 30 seconds, and he sat back down. Why did you not contest it? He said, gently. 2 attorneys, 3 at most. Pemberton would not have stood up to a real fight. Because I did not have 2 attorneys. I had your money in a joint account I refused to touch the moment I left. I had $800 of my own. I had a brother who had worked for 2 years to keep that scholarship, and a mother who had been sick that winter, and a father who had not been able to find steady work since the closure of the mill. I would not have won, Adrian, in time. By the time I won, the farm would have been gone, Eli would have lost his place, and your bond rating would have collapsed. And when I won, I would have come home to find that you had been told, by then, what your mother had done in your name, and you would not have forgiven her, and the foundation would have split, and you would have lost, not the money, the family, the fragments of a family. And I did not want to be the woman who arrived in your life and broke your mother in 2, even when she deserved it. He stared at her. You did not break her in 2, he said quietly. She broke you in 2 and made you carry the pieces. I am still carrying the pieces. You will not carry them alone any longer. Adrian, I am not asking. I am telling you, very gently, that whatever happens between you and me, whatever you decide about us, Whatever you decide about this child, my mother is not going to spend another day with that contract in her possession. I will deal with that. You do not have to. I'm only asking, before I do, that you let me listen one more thing. What? What do you want? She looked at him in surprise. What do you want, Lila? Not what would be safe for Eli, not what would be polite to my mother, not what would be sensible for your savings. What do you want? She did not answer right away. She put both hands over the curve of her belly. She felt the small, steady kick. She thought of the 17 months of silence, and of the small, clean room above the bookshop, and of Maggie Doyle, and of the man who was sitting across from her, with his hand still trembling slightly against the arm of the chair. I want my child to know its father, she said. I want its father to be the kind of man it deserves. I want, if I am being honest, not to be afraid anymore. She paused. And I would like very much to be able to use my own name again. He nodded slowly. Then those are the things I will work on. She looked down at her hands. Adrian, I have not said that I want to come back. I have not asked you to. I do not know yet what I want. About us. I have been alone for a long time. I am about to bring a small person into the world. I have to be careful for both of us. You have always been careful, Lila. I am not asking for anything. I am asking only, please only, that you let me be near. Let me drive you to your appointments. Let me carry your groceries up the back staircase. Let me know the name when you choose it. Let me earn, slowly, the right to be the person the child knows on the second day of its life. That is a lot to grant you in October. It is, I know. I will think about it. That is enough. He walked her home that afternoon. He did not take her arm. He did not crowd her. He walked at her pace, the slow, careful pace of a woman who was 32 weeks pregnant and tired. And he kept his hands in the pockets of his coat, and he did not say anything except once, when a gust of wind blew her scarf against her face. May I? And when she nodded, he reached forward and tugged the scarf gently back into place at her shoulder. And he stepped back, and he walked the rest of the way at her side in silence. At the bottom of the back staircase that led up to her small room, she stopped, and she turned to him. Thank you, she said, for listening, for not being who I was afraid you would be. I have been who you were afraid I would be, he said quietly. For a long time, for most of our marriage. In small ways I did not have the courage to see. I am not asking you to forget that. I am asking only to be allowed to do better. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she did the thing he did not expect. She reached forward, and she took his hand for 1 second, the way a person takes a hand to acknowledge a debt, and she squeezed it once, gently, and she released it. And she turned and walked up the stairs, one slow, careful step at a time, her free hand on the banister, the other resting lightly on her belly. He stood at the bottom of the stairs until she had reached the top. Then he walked back to the inn through the cold, blue afternoon light, and he sat down at the small writing desk in his small, clean room, and he opened his notebook to the first blank page. And he wrote, in careful block letters at the top, Things to do. And under that, the first item, Call Pemberton. Pemberton answered on the second ring. Mr. Vance, it has been some time. Mr. Pemberton, I'm going to ask you one question, and I'm going to ask it once, and I'm going to ask you to answer it without your customary delicacy. Did you draft a contract 18 months ago between my mother and my wife? There was a short pause on the line. Mr. Vance, I am, of course, bound by my obligations to my client. Mr. Pemberton, you are 76 years old. You have known me since I was 8. My mother is your client. My grandfather was your client. You currently hold the legal power of representation for the Vance Foundation, the Vance Family Trust, and 3 small holding companies that I personally fund. I am, in every meaningful sense, also your client. And if you want to retire next year with your reputation intact, you will tell me in the next 10 seconds whether the contract that I am about to describe to you is a real document. Adrian read the 4 key clauses aloud, exactly as Lila had given them to him. There was a longer pause. "Mr. Vance," said the elderly voice on the line, in a tone he had never heard from Pemberton before. "I have been waiting for 1 year and 5 months for you to ask me that question. The document is real. I drafted it under explicit instruction. I will be in your office at 9 the day after tomorrow, with a sealed copy and a complete file. I will resign as your mother's attorney, in writing, that same morning. I am sorry, son. I have wanted very much to be sorry to you in person." Adrian stood at the window of the Maplewood Inn and watched a small flock of starlings rise from the maples and reset on a different branch. "Thank you," he said. He did not call his mother that day. He did not call her the next day either. He called Theo Lansing, his chief operating officer, and told him what had happened. Theo, who had been at the wedding, who had liked Lila, who had wondered out loud at her disappearance for the entire 17 months, sat in his office in Midtown for a long, silent minute and then said, "Adrian, whatever you need, whatever it costs, the board, the press, the shareholders, the Hudson River Trust. Tell me what you need, and I will arrange it before lunch." "I need 3 things," Adrian said. "I need Pemberton's full file. I need a quiet, complete review of every transaction the Vance Foundation has made against the Reeves family farm in Vermont. And I need to know whether there is a way to dissolve the leverage on that property without asking my mother for anything. And I need a private, secure account opened in Lila's own name, untouchable by my mother, which I will fund out of my personal holdings, with enough to cover anything she might need in the next 10 years, and never ask me for permission. Done, done, and done." "Theo." "Yes?" "I am not coming back this week." "I figured." "Tell the board I am taking a leave." "They will ask why." "Tell them my wife is having a baby." There was a pause. "Yes, Adrian, I will tell them that." The storm came on Thursday. It was the first big November storm of the year. The weather service had been promising for 2 days that there would be wind, sleet, ice, and possibly several hours of power outage in the small towns along the river. By Thursday morning, the air in Maplewood had the dense, bright, electric quality of a coming front, and by noon, the sky had turned the color of pewter, and by 3 o'clock, the rain had begun, hard and slanting, and by 5, the rain had become ice, and the streetlights along the main street were beginning to crackle and flicker. At 6:15, the power went out. The diner did not close. The diner had a gas range, a gas water heater, 2 kerosene lamps left over from a similar storm in 2015, and Maggie Doyle, who had decided, the moment the power flickered, that the half-dozen elderly residents of the small senior apartments across the street were not going to spend a freezing night without a hot bowl of something. Maggie called the volunteer fire chief from the landline that, mercifully, was still working, and the 2 of them agreed that the diner would be the warming station for the block. And within an hour, Maggie had set out 15 folding chairs along the back wall, lit the kerosene lamps, set a great pot of beef and barley soup on the gas range, and put out a hand-lettered sign on the front window that read, "Soup, warmth, blankets, no charge, all welcome." Lila was already there when the power went out. She had stopped by the diner at 5:30 to bring Maggie a paperback Maggie had asked her to pick up at the bookshop. She had been about to walk home. The wind had been so bad that Maggie had handed her a hot mug of cocoa and told her to sit down for 15 minutes and let it pass. By the time the lights flickered the second time, Maggie was already pulling out the kerosene lamps, and Lila, in her navy coat, was already tying her apron back on without asking, because that was the kind of person she was. Adrian arrived 10 minutes after the streetlight on the corner finally went dark. He had been across the street at the inn. He had seen the sign in the window. He had put on his coat and his gloves, and he had walked across the icy street and pushed open the door of the diner, and the small bell above the door had rung in the sudden warm yellow lamplit dim, and he had said to Maggie Doyle, very quietly, "What can I do?" Maggie had looked at him for a long moment, over the rim of her glasses. "You can stack those chairs in the back, where it's drier. You can carry that crate of bread rolls from the truck out front. You can fold those blankets and put them on the booth seats so they don't get cold. You can keep an eye on the kerosene lamps and shout if one starts to smoke. And you cannot, under any circumstances, make a single fuss about any of it. Do you hear me, son?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Get to work." He worked for 4 hours. He stacked chairs, he carried bread, he folded blankets. He carried in 2 more cases of canned vegetables from the diner's tiny outdoor pantry through ankle-deep slush. He helped a small old woman named Ruth across the icy street from her senior apartment and into the warm yellow circle of lamplight, and he settled her at the counter with a bowl of soup, and he sat with her for 10 minutes while she told him about her late husband's love of model trains. He chopped onions in the kitchen, badly, and was banished from the chopping board by the busboy and reassigned to bringing fresh hot water to the dishwasher tray. He did not, at any point, mention his name. Lila moved through it all, slowly, calmly, with one hand resting on her belly when she was tired. She ladled soup. She refilled cups. She sat on the worn red vinyl bench beside Ruth when Ruth grew anxious about her cat and reassured her that the cat was fine, that cats were always fine, that her own grandmother's cat had once survived a cellar flood with nothing more than a sneeze. She was, Adrian saw, the gentle, quiet anchor at the center of every small, frightened person in that room. He watched her, and he could not have said, in that moment, whether he loved her more for what she had been at 24 in a midtown gallery, or for what she had become at 28 in a small diner in a town that had taken her in. A little after 10, the worst of the wind began to ease. The county trucks had cleared the main road. The volunteer fire chief had set up a generator in the senior apartments. Ruth and her neighbors were walked back across the street, one by one, supported by Adrian on one elbow and by the volunteer fire chief on the other. The kitchen was tidied. The kerosene lamps were turned down. Maggie sat down in a booth with a mug of coffee and her bad knee up on the bench beside her, and she said, with the slow, careful satisfaction of a woman who had run a small, good thing well, all right. We did it." Lila was sitting on the stool by the dishwasher. Her ankles were swollen. Her eyes were bright. She had been on her feet for nearly 7 hours. Adrian knelt down in front of the stool. "Lila." "Yes?" "I'm going to drive you home." "I can walk." "Yes, I know you can. And in any other November you would. Tonight I'm going to drive you the 4 blocks to your door, and I'm going to walk you up the back staircase, and I'm going to leave at the threshold. May I?" She looked at him for a long second. "Yes." He had brought his sedan around the back of the diner. He had warmed the seats. He helped her down from the stool with a hand under her elbow that he did not turn into anything more than that. He held the passenger door for her. He drove the 4 blocks at the slow, careful speed of a man who knew there was ice under the snow. He stopped at the foot of the back staircase that led up to her small room above the bookshop, and he switched off the engine, and he came around to her side and opened the door and offered his hand. She took it. She did not let go of it on the way up the stairs. She let go of it only at the top, at the small landing in front of her door, where she fumbled in her pocket for her key, and he held the railing for her steadiness, and she opened the door and stepped 1 foot inside. She turned, half over her shoulder. "Adrian?" "Yes." "Would you like to come in?" For 5 minutes. To see the room. He paused. You do not have to, she said. I would like to. She turned the lamp on. She offered him a glass of water. He stood, in his charcoal coat, just inside the door of a room that was the size of a Manhattan walk-in closet. A single bed with a quilt, a small dresser with a vase of dried hydrangea, a worn green armchair by the window, a tiny radiator that ticked once as the heat came back on, a small framed black and white photograph of her parents on the dresser, and a half-finished crib in the corner that she had clearly been assembling herself out of pieces of pine and a printed sheet of instructions. He looked at the crib. May I help you finish that? He asked. Tonight. On a day you choose. I am decent with a screwdriver. She gave a small, careful smile. Tomorrow afternoon, perhaps, after my shift. Tomorrow afternoon. She looked at him. Adrian. Yes. Thank you for what you did at the diner. I did very little. You did exactly what was needed and no more. That is something most men in my life have not been good at. He gave a small bow of his head that was, she thought, almost unconscious. I will go. Yes. He stepped back into the small landing. He set a hand briefly against the doorframe, the way a person does at a place he wants to remember. Good night, Lila. Good night, Adrian. She closed the door gently behind him. She stood on the inside of the closed door with her forehead against the wood, with one hand on her belly, and she felt the small, confident kick of the child, and she heard his footsteps go carefully down the back staircase, and she thought, with a quiet astonishment that was almost frightening, that she had not been afraid for a single moment of the entire long evening. She had been tired, yes, but not afraid. And that, she understood, was new. The press got hold of it on Saturday. It was not, as Adrian would later admit to Theo, a difficult story to find. A man in a charcoal coat and an Italian watch had been spending 5 days in a 4-room inn in a small Hudson Valley town, parking a sedan with city plates outside a small diner, and walking, in the evenings, with a visibly pregnant waitress along the icy sidewalk between the diner and a small bookshop. There were 16 inhabited houses along that route. 2 of them belonged to retirees who read the city tabloids every morning. One of them belonged to a woman who had a niece who worked, of all things, on the celebrity desk at one of those tabloids. The story broke at 6:15 on a Saturday morning under the headline, Vance heir found in Hudson Valley hideaway with pregnant mystery woman. The photograph was not flattering. It had been taken from across the icy street through the diner's lit window, and it showed Adrian, in his coat, kneeling in front of Lila on the stool by the dishwasher, with Maggie watching from the booth in the background, and the angle made it look as if he had been begging her for something. Adrian saw the headline at 6:28 when Theo's text came through. He sat down on the edge of his bed at the inn and read the article carefully, twice. The text described Lila as the unidentified pregnant brunette, guessed at her age, and noted with poisonous archness that she had been wearing a name tag that suggested she works at the diner. He picked up his phone. He texted Theo back. Statement at noon. I will draft it. I will send it to you for review by 10. Then he stood up, and he walked across the street to the diner, in his coat and his scarf, with a copy of the morning paper folded under his arm. Maggie was already at the counter when he came in. She looked up. She had not yet seen the paper. Maggie? Sweetheart, coffee? In a moment. May I show you something first? He set the paper, folded to the photograph, on the counter in front of her. Maggie looked down. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the headline. She looked at the small caption that named Adrian Vance and the company he had inherited. And she looked at the description of the unidentified pregnant brunette, and her mouth tightened in a way Adrian had seen, in his life, on perhaps 3 women. Lila does not know yet, he said quietly. She will know by 7. Yes, I'm going to tell her now. I want to speak with her in the kitchen, with you present, if she will allow it. I want to apologize to her, and I want to apologize to you. And I want to ask the both of you what you would like me to do. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Sit down at the counter, son. I'll get her. Maggie did not have to get her. Lila came through the swinging door from the kitchen at that exact moment, with a coffee pot in her hand, and the small, careful, pregnant gait that had become, over the past 5 days, intimately familiar to him. She saw the paper on the counter. She set the coffee pot down very carefully on the warmer. She looked at the photograph. Her face did not change. She looked up at him. Maggie's office, she said. Now. The office was a small room behind the kitchen, with a metal desk and a calendar of kittens. Maggie closed the door. Lila sat down in the chair by the desk. She did not cry. She did not fold her arms over her belly. She put both hands flat on the small surface of the desk in front of her, the way a person prepares to negotiate. Adrian. Yes. Tell me what your mother is going to do today. He had thought about this all night. She will see the headline by 7, he said. She will call me by 7:15. I will not answer. She will call Pemberton. He will not answer. By 10, she will be in a car heading north. She will arrive at the inn by 12:30. She will not, I think, come into the diner. She will summon me to the inn. If I do not come, she will summon me to the diner. If I do not come there either, she will, by tomorrow morning at the latest, send Mr. Pemberton's replacement up here with a polite written invitation, which will be a polite written threat. What do you want to do? I want to be in front of her, in this town, before she is in this town. I want to release a public statement at noon today, in your name and mine, that disarms her before she arrives. I want, and this is the part I am asking your permission for, Lila, I want, if you will let me, to publicly identify you. Not by your full name, if you do not want, but as my wife. Not my ex-wife. As the woman my mother forced out of our marriage, with the contract that I am now in possession of. I want to take the photograph and the article away from her by giving them my own caption. Lila was very still. You would do that, she said, without first speaking to her. Without speaking to her at all. Today, tomorrow, for as long as it takes. And the foundation. I will resign her chair on Monday. And the family will be smaller than it was, and more honest than it has been in 30 years. She looked at Maggie. Maggie said very quietly, Honey, he is asking permission. That is the right question. Lila looked back at Adrian. Show me the statement before you send it. Of course. Use my full name. Lila Reeves. Lila Reeves Vance, if you will allow it. She paused. She closed her eyes for a moment. Lila Reeves Vance, she said. Yes, allow it. The statement went out from the official Vance Holdings press office at 12:03. It was 3 short paragraphs, signed by Adrian Vance and authorized for release in the name of his wife, Lila Reeves Vance. It stated, plainly, that Mr. and Mrs. Vance had been separated for the past 17 months as the result of a private contract drawn up in April of the previous year by parties acting without Mr. Vance's knowledge or consent. That Mrs. Vance was carrying their first child, that the couple had been quietly and joyfully reunited in Maplewood, New York, and that Mr. Vance would be taking an indefinite personal leave from the day-to-day operations of Vance Holdings, with full operational authority transferred temporarily to Mr. Theo Lansing in order to be present with his family in this season of their lives. The statement also said, in its final sentence, that any further commentary or photographs concerning Mrs. Vance, the unborn child, the Reeves family, or the residents of Maplewood, New York, would be addressed by counsel as harassment, and that the Vance family was actively cooperating with the New York Attorney General's office on a separate matter relating to a pattern of coercive private contracts, the details of which would be provided in due course. Theo had inserted that final sentence himself. He had called Adrian at 11 and said, in his careful executive voice, "If you are going to do this, then do it. Make her afraid of the next sentence." Adrian had read the sentence 3 times and approved it. Vivian arrived in Maplewood at 12:41. She had read the statement at 12:05. She had not called Adrian. She had not called Pemberton. She had simply put on her grey cashmere coat, told her driver to take her north on the Taconic without stopping, and arrived at the small green door of the Maplewood Inn in a state of polished, immaculate, and entirely lethal calm. She did not come into the diner. She summoned Adrian to the inn by a short note on a folded card that the inn's owner brought across the street with a baffled expression. Adrian read the note. It said, "Adrian, come at once. Mother." He set it down on the counter. He looked up at Lila, who had set down a stack of plates and was watching in. "She has come." "Yes." "I would like, with your permission, to bring her here." "To the diner?" "To the diner, to the back booth, with Maggie and you and me at the table. Not as an ambush, as a meeting. So that whatever is said in front of the woman it has been done to. So that I cannot, later, pretend that I did not hear it. So that you do not have to imagine, ever again, what your mother-in-law did with her afternoon when I was not in the room." "Adrian." "Yes." "This is going to be hard." "Yes." "I would rather have it hard once than easy and unfinished." "Yes." "Bring her." He stood up, quietly. He kissed the air a foot above the back of her hand, the way a man honors a debt without taking a liberty. He walked out of the diner. He crossed the icy street. He went to fetch his mother. Vivian Vance walked into the Maplewood Diner at 1:15 on a cold November Saturday afternoon, in a grey cashmere coat, a pair of immaculate black gloves, a cream wool scarf, and a small silver brooch in the shape of an oak leaf that she had worn at her own engagement party in 1987. She did not look at the faded posters on the walls. She did not look at the pie case. She did not look at the half-dozen lunch customers who had quietly stopped chewing. She looked, immediately and only, at her son. Adrian had set up a back booth. Maggie sat at the booth nearest the kitchen, in a posture that pretended to be casual. Lila sat across from where Vivienne was about to sit, with a glass of water in front of her and her hands folded on the table. Adrian sat next to Lila. Vivienne approached. She paused at the edge of the booth. "Adrian, we do not need an audience for this." "This is not an audience, Mother. This is a witness." "I will not sit at a table with that woman." "Then you will not sit," Adrian said, very calmly. "And you will leave. And the conversation we have, if there is to be one, will happen in the New York Attorney General's office on Tuesday morning, with Mr. Pemberton in the chair beside you. I am quite content with that. I would prefer this." Vivian looked at him. She had perhaps expected to see, in his face, the same boy she had managed for 33 years. She did not see that boy. She sat down. "Mrs. Vance," Lila said quietly. "Hello." Vivian did not return the greeting. "Lila, please," Adrian said. "Tell my mother what you told me on Wednesday. As you told me, word for word, if you can. I want her to hear it from you." Lila looked at Vivian. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She did not allow her hands to shake. She told Vivian, in the same careful chronological order in which she had told Adrian, the story of the contract, the photographs, the loans on the farm, the scholarship for Eli, the phone call Vivian had answered, and the words, "Remember the contract," and the small, itemized statement that had appeared at her parents' house 3 days after she had written a single, careful letter from Lake Placid. She did not look away from Vivian's face once. When she was done, she folded her hands again, and she said, very quietly, "I have not lied about any of this. I am not lying now. You can ask Mr. Pemberton." "Mr. Pemberton is no longer in my employ," Vivian said. "That is correct," Adrian said. "He resigned by letter on Wednesday afternoon, and is currently a cooperating witness. I have a copy of his letter at the inn." Vivian sat very straight in her grey coat. She removed her gloves, finger by finger, and set them on the table beside her, and she looked at her son. "Adrian, you do not understand what I have spent 30 years protecting." "I think I do." "Then you understand that I cannot apologize for that. I do not need you to apologize for what you protected. I need you to apologize for who you broke in order to do it." "I did not break her, Adrian. She walked out." "Mother." He did not raise his voice. He simply leaned a little forward, and his hand, very lightly, found the back of Lila's hand on the table, and he held it there, as a man might hold a candle in a wind. And he looked at his mother across 30 years of careful arrangements and said, "You held a small bank, a small foundation, and a small set of social cruelties over a 26-year-old woman whose family farm has been in her family for 93 years. You used my name. You used my career. You used my mail and my doorman and my office. You wrote a clause about a child you did not know existed. You sat across from her in our library and showed her photographs you knew were not real, and made her sign a piece of paper that meant she would never be allowed, in this lifetime, to tell me what you had done to her. You did all of that, Mother. You. Not the family, not the foundation. You. And whatever you tell yourself about why, the woman across this table from you is the only person at this booth, including me, including you, who has the right to decide whether what you did is forgivable. Not the foundation, not the trust, not the bond rating on the South Pier. Her. Vivian opened her mouth. She closed it. For 1 second, in the dim, warm yellow afternoon light of the Maplewood Diner, Vivian Vance, 68 years old, the matriarch of a fortune, a woman who had presided at the Plaza and at the Met and at 3 governors' inaugurals. Vivian Vance looked, briefly, like a woman. Lila spoke first. "Mrs. Vance." Lila. It was the first time Vivian had used her name, and it caught in her throat on the second syllable, and she covered the catch with a small swallow. "Mrs. Vance, I am not going to forgive you today. I am not going to forgive you next week. I do not know if I will forgive you. I am 32 weeks pregnant and very tired, and I have spent 17 months and 4 days alone with what you did. And I will not pretend, here, in front of the man I married, that I am ready to be generous. I will tell you, however, what I am going to ask of you." Vivian looked at her. "I am going to ask you, today, to release the loans on my parents' farm, in writing, with Mr. Lansing as the witness. I am going to ask you to confirm today that the foundation scholarship that Eli Reeves has been receiving will continue, untouched, until the end of his degree, with no further oversight from your office. I am going to ask you to deliver, by Tuesday, a complete file of every photograph and every document you commissioned in the spring of last year against me, against Adrian, against my brother, and against my parents. And I am going to ask you, eventually, not today, for one private conversation in which you will tell me, without performance and without management, why." Vivian's eyes were wet. She was, very deliberately, not letting them spill. "I will agree to all of those terms." "Thank you." Vivian paused. "Lila." "Yes?" "My mother, my own mother, was a woman who married a man with 1/8 of what we had, and was punished by her family for 30 years for it. She was the kindest person I have ever known, and she died of that punishment by inches. And I told myself for 40 years that I would not allow that to happen to my son. I tell myself that still. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am only telling you that the thing I did to you was the thing my own mother would have died to spare me. And I, in my love for my son, in my fear of what fortune does to people, did it to you anyway. And I will live, now, with the fact that I became, in this matter, the person my own mother wept over. The table was very quiet. "Mrs. Vance," Lila said gently, "I am sorry your mother was punished." "Thank you, so am I. That does not mean what you did was all right. I know." Adrian sat between the two of them, with his hand still resting lightly over Lila's, and he said very quietly, "You will leave Maplewood today, Mother. You will return to the city. You will sign Lila's terms tonight. Theo will pick up the documents in person tomorrow morning. You will not come back to Maplewood unless Lila personally and freely invites you. You will not contact Eli or my wife's parents in any form ever again. Do you understand?" "Yes." "You will, in time, see this child, if Lila wishes it. If you have, by then, become a grandmother my child should know. That is on you, not on us." "Yes." She put her gloves back on. She stood up. She turned, with the immaculate, practiced poise of a woman who had walked out of harder rooms, and she walked to the door of the diner. And at the door she paused, and she did not look back, and she said in a voice that was almost steady, "Goodbye, Lila. Goodbye, Mrs. Vance." Vivian walked out into the cold November afternoon, and her car pulled away from the curb of the Maplewood Inn, and she did not, for a very long time, look out the window. In the back booth of the diner, Maggie Doyle stood up, walked over with a small carafe of coffee, refilled Lila's glass of water, and sat down across from them in the booth where Vivian had been a moment earlier. "Sweetheart," Maggie said gently to Lila. "Yes. You did that beautifully. I shook the entire time." "I know you did. So did I. That is why we did it together." Lila laughed, once, a small surprised laugh, and then she put her face in her hands, and she allowed the tears to come, finally, in the warm yellow safety of the diner, and the steady, comforting nearness of her husband's hand, and the quiet, strong presence of the woman who had taken her in 7 months earlier. Adrian did not move his hand from hers. He did not say anything. He simply sat beside her and let her cry. 2 weeks later, on a cold, bright Tuesday afternoon, the Maplewood Heritage Auction was held in the parish hall behind the church. It had nearly been cancelled. The volunteer consultant who normally handled the silent auction had broken her ankle in the November storm. The committee had been on the verge of postponing when Maggie, at a town meeting on the Friday after Vivian's visit, had stood up and said, very calmly, "Lila Reeves Vance has been a junior curator at a private gallery in New York City. She is also the woman who has been ladling soup at my counter for 7 months. I think she would say yes if you asked her, and I think she would do a beautiful job." The committee had asked her. Lila had said yes. She had organized the entire silent auction in 5 days. She had catalogued 47 items. She had drafted descriptions for every one of them. She had arranged the parish hall in a slow, careful rhythm of 3 small rooms, one for paintings, one for furniture, one for the small, handmade things by local artists. She had drafted a printed program with photographs and line drawings. She had set up the bidding cards, the lighting, the music, the small silver bell that signaled the closing of each round. She had done all of it on her feet, at 34 weeks, with her ankles taped and her back hurting, with Adrian behind her, carrying boxes when she would let him, and with Maggie behind Adrian, carrying coffee when neither of them would stop. The auction raised $73,000 for the Maplewood Library renovation. It was the largest single fund the auction had ever raised in 26 years. The press came up from the city for the closing reception. The local paper, the county weekly, two of the smaller New York Culture columns, a reporter for one of the better wire services who had heard about a Vance heir helping to set up bidding cards in a parish hall and could not believe her luck. Lila did the closing remarks. She stood at the small wooden lectern in a soft grey maternity dress with her hair down, and she thanked the donors, and she thanked the artists, and she thanked the volunteers, and she thanked, in particular, Maggie Doyle, who is the reason any of this happened, and who is the reason any of us are warm in this town when the storms come. She did not mention Adrian by name. She thanked simply, my husband, who has spent the last week unloading boxes and learning, against my vigorous protests, to hang a frame straight. The room laughed. A woman in the third row, who turned out to be the wife of the chairman of the New York Public Library Board, stood up at the end and asked Lila, in a clear, gentle voice, whether she might be interested, after the baby came, in considering a curatorial role at one of their satellite locations in the Hudson Valley. Lila said, very quietly, I would consider that conversation in March. The woman wrote down a phone number on a piece of paper from her program and crossed the room and pressed the paper into Lila's hand. And she did not let go of Lila's hand until she had said, gently, I am very glad you are all right, dear. Adrian, watching from the back of the room, did not cry. He came close. They went home together that night. It was the first time she had used the word. Adrian had rented, 2 days after Vivian's visit, a small white farmhouse on a quiet road 3 miles outside Maplewood, with 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, a working chimney, a small barn that had been converted into a studio, a back porch with a swing, and a view, through the bare November trees, of a long sloping meadow that ran down to a stand of birches by a creek. It was a quarter the size of his apartment in the city. He had, at her request, signed a 6-month lease, not a purchase agreement. She had moved her things from the room above the bookshop on the Sunday morning before the auction. There had been 3 suitcases, the small framed photograph of her parents, a canvas bag of second-hand baby clothes she had found at the church thrift sale, a half-finished crib in pieces, the worn green armchair the bookshop owner had insisted she keep, and the navy wool coat. They drove home from the auction with the heat in the sedan turned all the way up. Lila sat in the passenger seat, with her hands resting on her belly. The lights of the small town fell behind them. The road curved into the dark. Adrian? Yes? I would like to renew our vows. He glanced at her, briefly, in the dim green dashboard light. Now? Not now. After the baby. In the spring. In the parish hall, if Maggie will let us, with Eli to walk me. With my mother and father in the front row, with Maggie to say the prayer. With your mother in the back row, if she has by then earned it. Yes. I do not want a do-over. I do not want to forget the 17 months. I do not even, now, want to forget what your mother did. I want to stand in front of the people who held me up while I was alone. And I want to choose you, on purpose, in front of them, with the knowledge of what we have already broken and what we have already fixed. I want it to be small. I want it to be real. Yes, Lila. She rested her hand, briefly, against his on the gearshift. And I want, she said, more quietly, to keep my name. Lila Reeves Vance. Both. Always. Yes. The baby came on the 2nd of January, in a thin grey dawn, after 12 hours of slow, careful labour at the small hospital in town, with Adrian beside Lila for every minute of it, with Maggie in the waiting room knitting a tiny grey cardigan she had, against her own better judgment, started in November. The baby was a girl. They named her Iris Margaret Reeves Vance. Margaret for Maggie. Iris for the small, bright spring flower that Lila's grandmother had planted in 1947 along the front border of the Vermont farm. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces. She had her father's quiet, attentive eyes and her mother's careful mouth. She did not cry on her first morning, except once, very briefly, when the hospital nurse weighed her, and she stopped at once when Lila's voice spoke her name. Adrian held her, for the first time, on the small, narrow hospital bed beside Lila, with both of his arms folded carefully around the impossible, warm, small weight of her. And he could not, for a long time, find words. Lila, half asleep, watched him. "Adrian." "Yes?" "Say something." He looked down at the small face. He looked at his wife. He looked back at the small face. "Hello, Iris," he said, in a voice that was almost steady. "I am very pleased to meet you. I am your father. I am late. I am very, very glad to be here." Iris did not, of course, answer. Lila did. She put her hand on his knee. "You are not late," she said. "You are exactly on time." He did not, for the rest of his life, forget her saying that. 6 weeks after the baby, on a clear, bright Saturday in late February, Adrian drove down to Manhattan for the first time since October. He went to his mother's apartment. He did not bring Lila. He did not bring the baby. He sat across from Vivian in her drawing room, in the same green wing chair he had sat in as a boy, and he handed her a small framed photograph of Iris asleep against Lila's shoulder. Vivian looked at the photograph for a long time. She did not weep. She rested the photograph carefully, with both hands, on the small marble table between them. She looked up at her son. "Adrian." "Yes." "I have been to 2 sessions with the therapist Mr. Lansing recommended. I have been to 3 meetings of a small private group of women run by the Episcopal Diocese that I would not have been seen in 5 years ago. I have written a letter to Lila's mother, which I have not yet sent, because I am not yet sure that I have written it well enough. I have resigned 3 boards. I have, last week, sold the small bank that held the loans on the farm, and I have taken what I made on the sale and donated it, anonymously, to the Maplewood Library. I am telling you these things, Adrian, not because I expect them to count toward forgiveness. I am telling you because I have not, in 30 years, told anyone what I am doing, and I am trying to learn to." "Mother." "Yes." "That is a beginning." "It is." Lila said, in November, that she would, in time, sit across from you and ask you why. She has not yet said when. When she does, you will answer her. I will. She will know if you are performing. I know she will. He stood up. He picked up his coat. He paused at the doorway, and he looked back at the small framed photograph on the table. "Mother." "Yes." "Iris will, eventually, have a grandmother. I do not yet know whether that grandmother will be you. That depends on you. On Lila. Not on me. I understand. I love you." He had not said it to her in 3 years. He said it now, plainly, the way he had learned to say things to Lila, and he did not stay to watch her response. He pulled the door of the drawing room closed gently behind him, and he walked through the long hall of the apartment on 5th Avenue, and he took the elevator down to the lobby, and he stepped out into the cold, bright city afternoon, and he drove north, 3 hours, to a small white farmhouse on a quiet road outside Maplewood, where a woman in a grey maternity dress had become, by then, a woman in a soft cream sweater, holding a small sleeping baby on the back porch, and where the woman looked up at the sound of his sedan, and she smiled, and she lifted the baby's small hand and waved it at him, and he waved back through the windshield, like a man who had finally come home. They renewed their vows on a Saturday in late April, in the parish hall behind the Maplewood church. There were 38 guests. Eli walked Lila down the aisle in a navy suit. Lila's mother sat in the front row in a soft pink Sunday dress. Lila's father, who had not, in 17 months and 4 days, said a single word against Adrian, sat next to her in the only suit he owned and held her hand the entire ceremony. Maggie Doyle stood beside Lila as her witness, in a green wool dress and her best gold earrings. Theo Lansing stood beside Adrian as his. Vivian sat in the back row. She had, at Lila's invitation, written by hand on a small card the week before, come up the previous afternoon, alone, in a small navy dress, with a wrapped baby gift and a sealed envelope and a quiet mouth. Lila had embraced her at the door of the parish hall, briefly, with the courtesy of a host. Vivian had wept, very quietly, into Lila's shoulder for the count of 6. Then Vivian had stepped back, and she had wiped her eyes, and she had said, "Thank you, dear." And she had taken her seat in the back, where she stayed. The vows were short. Adrian said, "I promise, this time, to be the man your 17 months alone earned for you." Lila said, "I promise, this time, to let you." Maggie laughed and cried, and rang a small silver bell. The room laughed and cried with her. Iris, in a tiny white cotton dress, lay asleep on Lila's mother's shoulder in the front row, and did not, even once, complain about the singing. At the reception, Lila stood at a long table covered in a white cotton cloth, with a glass of sparkling cider in her hand, and she looked across the room at Adrian, who was bending down to listen to old Ruth from the senior apartments tell him, in detail, about her late husband's love of model trains. Lila smiled. She thought, with a small surprised joy, that she had been right on a Tuesday morning in October to look up. She thought she had been right to walk to the kitchen. She thought she had been right on a Wednesday afternoon in a bookshop to tell him. She thought, watching her husband listen with patience and warmth and a quiet, attentive kindness to a woman whose stories did not, in any market in the world, count for anything, that she had married, in the end, the man she had hoped he might be. A year and a half later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in October, on a soft autumn morning that smelled of bacon and coffee and fresh bread and cinnamon, Adrian Vance walked into the Maplewood Diner with a small girl on his hip. Iris was 20 months old. She had her father's quiet, attentive eyes, and her mother's careful mouth, and a thatch of dark curls that refused, no matter what Lila did, to lie flat. She wore a small denim jumper and a pair of red corduroy shoes, and held, in her left hand, a slightly mauled stuffed rabbit named Bun. Maggie was at the counter. "There is my girl," Maggie said. "Hi, Maggie," Iris said. Adrian set Iris on the counter. Maggie passed her a small triangle of buttered toast. Iris began to gnaw on it, with the dignified focus of a small judge weighing evidence. "Where is your wife?" Maggie asked. "Parking. The library board called. There is, apparently, a small crisis with the spring exhibition." "Of course there is." Maggie looked then, past Adrian's shoulder, at the wall behind him. He turned. He had not, in 18 months, stopped noticing it. Above the long row of mismatched stools, in a small, simple wooden frame, hung a pale blue waitress dress with a white half apron and a small gold name tag pinned above where the heart would be. The name tag, in Maggie's careful printing, read Lila. Beside it, in a second, smaller frame, hung a single page from the Maplewood Heritage Auction Program, signed at the bottom in Lila's even hand. Below both frames, on a small brass plate Maggie had ordered the previous Christmas, were 3 lines. Lila Reeves Vance, who walked into this diner on a Sunday in March, and who stayed. The bell above the door rang. Lila came in a navy peacoat over a soft grey sweater, with her hair down, and her face still flushed from the cold, and the careful, upright, steady walk of a woman who had not, in many years, been a tired, pregnant waitress. She crossed to the counter. Iris held out a small, buttered hand. Lila kissed the top of her daughter's head. "Hi, my love." Adrian put his hand against the small of her back. "Coffee?" "Please." Maggie poured. Iris, attentively, ate her toast. Outside, a few brittle leaves moved across the gravel of the lot. Adrian sat down beside Lila on a worn red vinyl stool in the warm yellow morning light of the Maplewood Diner, and he understood, with a quiet, certain ache that had nothing in common with anything he had ever felt in a boardroom, that the woman he had been afraid he had lost on a clear, bright Wednesday morning in May had been waiting for him all along, exactly where she needed to be, at exactly the speed life would let her go. And that whatever the world believed it knew about Adrian Vance and his Hudson Valley hideaway and his pregnant mystery woman, the only true caption for the photograph belonged, finally, to her. He had walked into a small diner. He had walked out into his life.